Well, thank you. Michael just gave us a fantastic foundational understanding of Agenda 21. I'm going to show you more of how they have actually implemented it, the stages, the utter deceit in which they have used to be able to implement it, and the driving ideology behind it. Because I think we have an opportunity to begin to confront them and give back to them as they have taken on us over the last 30 years. I'm going to start very basically with my two books, Rescuing a Broken America, Why America is Deeply Divided and How to Fix It Constitutionally. That is a powerful, powerful book that goes into the environmental issues as well as constitutional issues and how to fix it. You end up with a two-chapter discussion on coordination, but you can't use coordination in California because you have basically progressives in your local government. And progressives hate this particular approach. So your first evidence or effort, as Michael just described, is to get rid of those, vote them out of office, and put in constitutionally oriented city councilmen, county commissioners, and so forth, school boards, because it works with any elected government, and it has stopped the federal government dead in its tracks all across America. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of counties and city councils and town councils and so forth that are currently implementing this across the country. It is a very powerful tool, but it'll only work if you have a constitutionally oriented elected board of whatever. On the right is Plundered. That's just 2 weeks old now. It is one of the best-selling books we've ever had. It's not even fully published yet. It's still in editorial form, so I'm discounting it here because it still has a few editorial errors in it. But nonetheless, it is the best-selling book that we have ever had. It is just going out of our office like hotcakes. Why? Because I've gotten comments back, it is spellbinding. Literally spellbinding. I've had people say that they started reading it when they were going to bed at 10 o'clock at night, and at 2:30 they realized it's 2:30 and they thought it was maybe 11 o'clock or so. And I think if we utilize what's in this book, we can begin to push back and throw into their face the same thing they have thrown into ours for so many decades. That's the War of Worldviews. I'm going to talk about that first. It's going to be a very, very abbreviated discussion because we don't have much time in an hour. Agenda 21 and smart growth. Agenda 21, Michael has addressed, but I'm going to give you a little different slant on it. Biodiversity and the Wildlands Project, that's what led me to be able to stop the Biodiversity Treaty from being ratified in the U.S. Senate, and I'm going to explain that as well. I again went into detail last night. I'm not going to give that much detail today, but it was really an action of God. There's no question. And then what we can do. Coordination is one of the methods. You can't use it yet because you need to start at the first rung and get rid of your progressive leadership in your local governments. So the world of worldviews. Before I get into that, education is a key component, as Michael has indicated. And I want to start out with a plan developed by HUD back in 1970. Actually, it was several years before that they were doing the work. It was just published in 1970. It's the Behavioral Science Teacher Education Program, B-STEP, and you will not believe it, especially those of you who have gray hair like me, because you knew what our country was like in 1970. The newer generations don't. You knew our government in the 1970s basically supported the people, were basically accountable to the people. But this is what they planned back in 1970. Long-range planning and implementation of plans will be made by a technologically scientific elite. We're seeing that all over the place now through all of these plans and so forth. This will strain the democratic fabric to the ripping point. Are we there? Yeah. We are. The Protestant ethic will atrophy as more and more enjoyed varied leisure and guaranteed sustenance. The work as a means and the end of living will diminish. As an end of living will diminish. Most people will tend to be hedonistic, pleasure-seeking in other words, and a dominant elite, and provide the dominant bread and circuses to keep the social extension and disruption at a minimum. A small elite will carry society's burdens. The resulting impersonal manipulation of most people's lifestyles will be softened by provisions for pleasure-seeking and a guaranteed physical necessities. That is describing what we're seeing today, and this was written back in 1970. It goes on to say that the use of the system's approach to problem solving and of cybernetics to manage automation will remold the nation. And they have definitely succeeded in remolding the nation. We're one step away from the final conclusion, and 2 days before President Obama won the election for president in 2008, he basically said, we are 2 days away from a fundamental transformation in the United States, and he has been trying to implement it ever since. Most of the population will seek meaning through other means or devote themselves to pleasure-seeking. The controlling elite will engage in power plays largely without the involvement of most of the people. Society will be a leisurely one. People will study, play, travel. Some will be in various stages of drug-induced experiences. Each individual will be saturated with ideas and information. Never have we had so much knowledge at our fingertips as we have today. Some will be self-selected. Other kinds will be imposed overtly by those who assume responsibilities for your and my actions. In other words, they're designing the governmental system, as Michael just described, to control every action that you and I make. Relatively few individuals will be able to maintain control over their opinions. Most will be pawns of competing opinion molders. It goes on, and in my book, Plundered, I go into detail. Now, who are these people that wrote this document? The U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, the American Academy of Sciences and Sciences, Arts and Science, American Academy of Political and Social Sciences, the General Electric, U.S. Air Force, Rand Corporation, Hudson Institute, Ford Foundation, University of Illinois. The list goes on, just like Michael described what he was talking about. We have companies, we have government, and we have public-private partnerships that are seeking to mold us into this particular category so that we will be a compliant citizenry and do whatever they tell us to do. Now, what is our foundation? Michael mentioned it a little bit. John Locke, I'm just going to touch on it, the father of the U.S. Constitution, wrote several dissertations that provide the foundation for our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution. Frederick Bastiat, a French legislator, wrote the little pamphlet called The Law after reading John Locke. Fantastic little pamphlet if you can get it, The Law. Sir William Blackstone, the first English lawyer to establish the legal profession in London and the first law school, and wrote the first legal dictionary based on John Locke's writing. Thomas Jefferson, of course, James Madison, and so forth. All of our founders refer back to Locke as a source of what they are creating the United States to become. The Locke model, the People's Law as they were called, established a balance between 100% tyranny and 100% anarchy. And it's just as we heard earlier, it's based on God-given unalienable rights given to us as people, as individuals who are the sovereign, who give portions of their rights to the city government for governance, the county government a little bit less, state government a little bit less than that, and as Michael said, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution of the United States only gives the federal government 18 enumerated powers, very restrictive powers. Of course, they have broken through that barrier and now have granted themselves unlimited powers. The key point here, I know I'm talking to the choir, but we need to have this as a foundation of understanding. The Constitution is not designed to restrict people, you and I. It's designed to restrict the government. 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 It's designed Government is raw power. And power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, as Lord Acton said. And what we are seeing is the absolute corruption of our political system, especially with this administration. James Madison basically said the same thing that John Locke said, that the government is instituted to protect private property of every sort, as well as that which lies in the various rights of individuals. This being the end of government. When I show this to a general audience, I can hear an audible gasp. I don't think that's too surprising to you. But nonetheless, the purpose of government is to protect our private property rights, because if your private property rights are protected, your liberties are protected, as well as the economic engine to create wealth. I could spend the next 20 minutes on that alone. And we're all having a discussion this afternoon. I hope some of that's brought out. That alone, Madison says, is a just government which impartially secures to every man whatever is his own. Now, when I say it's basic to the wealth creation, if you look at the average 2010 income for Americans, is $47,200. It's a little bit higher than that now. It was actually a little bit higher than that in 2010 too, because the 2008 crash kind of took it out of us. But it was $47,200. The socialist Europeans was $32,700. Why? Because it's socialist. They have rule after regulation after law restricting the use of private property rights. And when that happens, for some social good, and when that happens, you lose the equity value in your home. And so the bank will only loan you so much. And you only have a certain income. It's only, and John Locke knew this, only when you have a totally free market enterprise, not restricted by government other than those laws that are necessary to prevent one person harming another, will you have true potential for wealth creation. 70% of every small business in this country are started with equity loans on personal property. 70%. If that goes down, we have just that much less equity to borrow against to start a business or to buy into a business through stock. It is the key to becoming the wealthiest nation in the history of mankind. But we're rapidly losing it. Interestingly enough, Canada, who has had a tremendous number of social impairments or impediments, is coming out of that. They have started to reduce the regulatory structure, and their country has literally bounced back economically, and it's in much better condition than that of the United States. The former communist nations in 1992 was less than $2,000 per year. Today it's between $10,000 and $20,000 as they have gradually more property rights. The third world nation is always less than $10,000, usually less than $2,000 a year, because they have no private property rights. Ironically, when the Soviet Union collapsed, we rushed into the vacuum that was created and implemented capitalism. And we did everything that capitalists are supposed to do except make sure that they had private property rights. Private property rights were not established, and the whole thing failed, and now they hate capitalism because it was a total failure to them. The key ingredient, the foundation of wealth creation, is private property rights. If you plot the per capita gross income around the world for all the nations over their index of legal private property rights, you see this curve. Yes, there's a lot of variability because there are other things that impact this, but this is the only thing that has even close to a 75% correlation. Private property rights are absolutely critical. The other philosophy that has now almost gained total dominance here in the United States and kicked out the John Locke philosophy in the form of government is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. French philosopher that came on the heels with Locke. He is known as the father of the French Revolution, modern European socialism and communism. Why? Because George W.F. Hegel, who has literally ruined the education system in this country, Karl Marx, Frederick Engels, were all students of Rousseau. It's led to the most bloody form of government man has ever known, even when you consider Attila the Hun. He looked at private property rights this way. Property rights, he said, were designed by the rich to place new fetters on the poor and gave new powers to the rich, which irretrievably destroyed natural liberty, and for the advantage of a few ambitious individuals subjected all mankind to perpetual labor, slavery, and wretchedness. Exactly the opposite of John Locke. And so he wrote many of his letters and so forth condemning the Locke model. So why would he basically want to create freedom by using a system that will actually destroy freedom? Because he didn't know any better. And I think because he was helped by a few individuals that didn't want to see that system come into France, but that's beside the point. Remember, Rousseau wrote these in the 1800s. The French Revolution wouldn't come until 1892, or 1792, thank you. And it was the nobility that owned all the property and the Catholic Church at that time. Two distinct groups. It was a feudal system of government. And to break the power of the nobility and the church, he set up a system that forced them to give property to the government. Not to the people, but to the government. And therefore he established this. The state in relationships to its members is master of all goods through the social contract, which within the state is the basis of all rights. They're called positive rights. They're basically what the state gives. They're not unalienable. And what the state giveth, the state can taketh away. And it does. This particular form of government is exactly the opposite of the people's law that we just saw. All power resides in the federal government, and the state government is just a subsidiary of the federal government, an administrative branch to carry out local activities, as is the local government. And the people and families, you and I, have no power, no rights whatsoever other than those given by the federal government. Everything that you have seen the last 3.5 years is being designed to establish the sovereignty of the federal government over the states. Every single action that interrelates with the states that Obama is doing, the Arizona lawsuit, you name it, you go right down the list, is all designed to establish the federal authority and sovereignty over the states. That's not how it was originally designed, as you well know. Now, I want to talk a little bit about my brand new book. It's only been out 2 months, or 2 weeks, and really, I think, opens the eyes of people to what this progressive ideology really is doing behind the scenes. I break it down step by step and look at every aspect of it. And it apparently, I didn't know that when I wrote it, the author is the last one to know, it is a real spellbinder. The French Revolution was actually started with this progressive ideology. It wasn't called that then, but the French Revolution, as you well know, was the bloodiest modern war in history. Even worse than Hitler. At least Hitler had the decency to send his victims into the gas chambers. People in the French Revolution not only were decapitated by guillotine, but were also pulled apart. Their limbs were literally pulled off of them while they were still alive. This is how brutal, utterly brutal this system can become. And when you consider the well over 100 million citizens of governments have been massacred with the communist system in Russia and China, it always leads to violence. And we're seeing that you don't see it because it's not being reported anymore. It was last year, but it's not being reported anymore. The utter violence that is going on in Europe right now as the European Union crumbles. The early progressives, I'm going to define that. You'll be surprised at how constant they have been over time. It's destroying America, financial destruction, and the corruption of education. I just read you the two things from B-Step, as I call it. They have controlled our educational process for at least 3 generations, mostly in urban areas. That's why when you see a map of how people vote, more counties in rural areas vote for Republicans, and the cities always vote for the liberals because they have been brainwashed. They don't know any better. They have never been taught the constitutional foundation upon which this nation is established and the freedoms that it has given them to do what they're doing today. In 1995, a brand new science called psychiatry was being introduced. And Gustave Le Bon, a Frenchman, wrote this book, The Group. It was actually used by Adolf Hitler to be able to control the masses of his people. Of course, he was doing exactly the opposite of what Gustave suggested, but nonetheless, it was a tip-off as to how he could manipulate the masses. He wrote the book, The Crowd, the study of the popular mind, because it was beginning to be very, very dangerous. And he said this, and I go into much more detail, give examples of modern day, what's happening today in the book. Sentiments and ideas of all the persons involved take one and the same direction, and their conscious personality vanishes. Have you seen that? It's like a mob. A collective mind is formed, but presenting very clearly defined characteristics. One of these is that they no longer consider themselves, but they have become automatons. They just walk around like robots espousing their propaganda. They have ceased to be guided by their own wills. It's just one thing after another. This was written in 1895, and we're seeing it being played out today. They most often have only a very distant relationship to the observed fact. They can't connect with reality. I've talked to psychiatrists that have this understanding, and they say he was right on. They cannot connect to reality. They develop all of these fantastic plans and schemes and so forth to help people and only wind up destroying them. Because that's what's going to happen with our entitlements if something isn't changed. They have a sense of invincible power. They're utterly arrogant. They believe they have all truth. And you are just a bunch of idiots out there. The contagion of thought, something happens, and one of the leaders in this movement basically says something, and the whole country says it the next day. An individual sacrifices his personal interest to the collective interest. The unions, I was just in Wisconsin earlier this week, and the unions, even though they are destroying the state and themselves along with it, continue their demands, even though they will be destroyed if they ever get what they want. Doesn't matter. Winning is everything. Commits acts of utter contradiction with his character and habits. They can be very nice people. But when they begin to fall back on their belief system, their ideology, they can become extremely arrogant and even violent. The mere fact that he forms part of an organized crowd or a mob, a man descends several rungs into a ladder of civilization. Isolated, he may be a cultivated individual in a crowd. He's a barbarian. And you have seen in recent months, time after time after time, and it's ripping Europe apart right now. Hasn't gotten that bad, but Occupy Wall Street is a symptom. Occupy Wall Street, contrary to the basic fundamental media, is highly organized and very well funded. It's organized in a way that kind of demonstrates that people are just there, they're just average people. They don't really know what they want, but they're upset. That's the purpose, except the whole thing was planned that way. Hundreds of millions of dollars were planned setting this up. It's all detailed in the book. I have it all in the book. Without the restraining presence of the representatives of authority, the contractor, the contradictor, that's you and me, the one who disagrees with the mob, indeed would often be put to death. If there wasn't some sort of legal barrier holding them back, I have no doubt in the world, and we've seen it, it's really starting to happen in Europe. We saw a little bit with the Occupy Wall Street, but it's going to get worse. I think it's going to start up again next month. And they would be utterly violent to the point of putting you to death. Some of the things they say, as you have seen, is just unbelievable. Talking about murdering those who disagree on global warming. Basically, every one of them should be sent to the concentration camp or disposed of. All of these statements are made by this ideology. I spoke 2 days ago to a crowd of about 250 people. It was a mixed audience of natural resource users. And the audience really accepted what I had to say. And at the end, I opened it up to questions, and one little girl jumped up, and she said, I am one of these conservation biologists who works for the U.S. Forest Service, and I want to tell you, you don't know what you're talking about. Arrogance. I know exactly what I'm talking about. You're not using real science. No, I'm using real science. They're using pseudoscience. And she said, I'm so disgusted, I would not be able to go to sleep unless I said something. And there was dead silence on the audience. And I said, thank you. You said everything I wanted to say. And concluded the meeting, and I got a standing ovation. She must have felt like a little worm. But you know what she did then? She went and stood in front of my book table to keep people from buying any of the material that would help them understand what I was talking about. These people are energized. They will do anything to stop you. They will demonize you. They will degrade you. They will do anything to stop you. So if you start taking action, expect it. Wear it like a crown, because you are basically exposing the fact that they utterly hate you. They're the greatest haters. They're the greatest bigots in the United States, and yet they accuse you and I of doing that. It's time to give them back what they have given us. It's exciting to see how the Tea Party movement, how Eagle Forum as I go around the country, how the conservatives are beginning to stand up and to be counted. It's not going to help us in the presidential race unless we put tremendous pressure, assuming that Romney gets into office. I'm not sure that that's going to happen, because we basically would replace one with another. But nonetheless, if we put tremendous pressure on him, he may be forced to actually walk the talk. But I will say this, that the true area that you need to put foot leather to, or shoe leather to, is in your local elections, just like Michael indicated. That's where change is going to come. That's where you can begin to push this thing back. We can't let Congress and we can't let the presidency go unchallenged, but at the same time, each of us needs to get involved and support a candidate. It may be a Congress or Senate, because you have that opportunity with Feinstein this year. We heard several people that are running against her, and I wish them the more power, the better. But the key is to turn off your TV and really put your energy into supporting someone that is running on a constitutional basis at some level of government. You can't spread your efforts too greatly because otherwise you won't be any good. You've got to focus on just a small target, maybe 2 candidates, but that's the most. You can support others who are supporting other candidates when the time comes to stand up, but at the same time, your energy, your shoe leather has to go in a targeted direction. And I'm challenging you right now, if you want to save this country, because we're one election away from destruction, you have to stand up and get active in doing something in your local area. You see the violence in England even a year ago. You've seen it with the Occupy Wall Street, although not as violent. Nonetheless, I think it's going to get very violent this summer. And it all comes from the rules from radicals, as you probably all know. It's been written about very much in Eagle Forum by Saul Alinsky. I've gone through it. I define it in the book. Basically, it is unbelievable. I'll just give you a couple things. You all know probably that it's dedicated to Lucifer. And what we're seeing really is the handiwork of Lucifer. But the third rule, this is on page 29, the third rule of ethics means the ends is that in a war, the ends justify almost any means. And I want to really emphasize that point because they will lie, they will cheat, they will tell you anything that you want to hear and then turn right around and stab you in the back or do just exactly the opposite. The difference between the progressives and the extremist Muslims, there is no difference in this regard. They will tell you anything you want to hear, but they mean something totally different. You cannot trust anything they say. The progressive ideology has resulted in severe unintended consequences. As you well know, we basically now have a $15.6, almost $7 trillion national debt. This is a couple weeks old, which each of us owes $137,000, $138,000. I hope you brought your pocketbook and we can start paying that down. With a $1.3 trillion expected deficit. Once more, and as you well know, by the end of his first term, Obama would have racked up more in debt than all the presidents up to George Bush in history. And yet he doesn't care. I'll explain why in just a moment. But that's nothing compared to the unfunded liabilities that we're now experiencing, $118 trillion. The gross domestic product of the entire world is only $63 trillion. And yet, that means $1 million for each of us. There's no way we can pay that. And yet, these progressives have fought tooth and nail to change anything to make it on sound footing, which means they're so ideologically driven they cannot see the truth, which could be for many people, or they are trying to collapse the U.S. system, just as Michael said. There is no other choice. It will destroy this country within 10 years unless they're changed and made more quote-unquote sustainable. That's getting a bad name, but nonetheless, that's the case. Let me just give you an example of what this means. You see one $100 bill there. You see 10,000 $100 bills, 1 million $100 bills, 1 billion $100 bills, 1 trillion $100 bills, 15 trillion $100 bills. That's our debt right now. In fact, it's exceeding that. You begin to see something visually. And by the way, your visual expressions of things will work far better than just facts and figures. This is the same $15 trillion pile of money of $100 bills, but this is $116 trillion $100 bills. There's no way we can pay that off. Either we're going to suffer a financial collapse, which is, I think, what they want, or they're going to put us into a period of hyperinflation, which is becoming more and more a reality. Because you don't understand fully, unless you have access to certain membership sites, what is really going on in Europe. There is really no hope that Europe will be salvaged. It's going to go down. Just last week, the Prime Minister of Spain basically said there is no way The European Central Bank can bail them out. It has to be done by the IMF if it's going to work. Guess who pays the money into the IMF? Us. And Spain isn't the only one. They've already bailed out Portugal, Ireland, and Greece. Greece actually collapsed last summer. They just kept it going with baling wire and tape. And if Europe goes down, we're interrelated with $10 trillion worth of Europe that we would be vulnerable to on our balance sheet. What's going to happen to the United States? We're going to take a huge hit. China right now is beginning the process of attacking the US dollar to unseat it as the world's reserve currency. If they're successful, and I don't know that they will be, but it's going to take a couple of years for that to happen, we will have hundreds of trillions of dollars that are now floating around the world come back to US shores, and our dollar bill will be worth nothing. That's what we're facing. And I will tell you this right now, it's the progressives in both the Republican as well as the Democratic Party that have put us there. Every dollar in debt that we're suffering right now has come from a progressive action, either on the Republican side or the Democratic side. This is what Paul Krugman said on January 1st. Paul Krugman is the progressives of progressives for the New York Times. And he says that when people in D.C. talk about deficits and debt, by and large, they have no idea what they're talking about. And the people who talk the most understand the least. So I don't know anything about it. Families have to pay back their debt. Okay, we understand that. Governments don't. Oh, really? Ask China about that. All they need to do is ensure that the debt grows more slowly than their tax base. And I'll tell you, if the dollar goes down as the world's reserve currency, our tax base will be meaningless. We need more, not less, government spending to get us out of our unemployment trap, and the wrong-headed, ill-informed obsession with debt is standing in the way. Now do you begin to understand why the progressives in Congress blocked every effort to maintain the debt ceiling last summer? Why they are blocking every effort to reform entitlements? Because they don't think debt is a problem. It's irrelevant. These people are utterly and absolutely dangerous. But that's not the worst of it. The Liberal Mind was published by Lyle Rossiter a couple years ago. 40 years experience, has done many research studies and so forth, and he comes up with this conclusion. And he basically talks about liberals, but I qualify that by saying progressive liberalism, because I have met many liberals that are liberals and they have actually followed the progressive leadership because they don't know any better. That's what they've been taught, but they do want to do the right thing. And they are open-minded, and you can convince them. So I don't really say that all liberals are involved. It's the progressive liberals. Under careful scrutiny, progressive liberalist distortions of the normal ability to reason can be only understood as a product of psychopathology. What that means is that there are quite a few cards short of a full deck. And many of you have known that and seen that time after time after time. The modern liberal mind, its distorted perceptions, and its destructive agenda are the product of disturbed personalities. He goes on to explain why that's the case. I'm not going to get into that. And basically, you cannot convince them otherwise. They know the truth. They know that you're stupid. They think they're deep critical thinkers, and really they're only very shallow linear thinkers. Gun control. Guns kill, so we got to get guns out of the society. Never mind that criminals can get guns. And that's why criminal activity, murders and so forth, skyrocket after gun control is initiated. They are very simple linear thinkers. They cannot think critically. but yet they control our political system, our judicial system, our educational system, and the media, this way of thinking. Thomas Jefferson, after seeing what happened in France, he was an ambassador before the French Revolutionary War. He went over there afterwards to congratulate them and was horrified. He understood the Rousseau methodology. People think that our founders apparently were very ignorant. They weren't. They were very knowledgeable. They were very studied. And he was horrified to realize that they're implementing the Rousseau model of government, knew the catastrophes that would result, and when he came back, he wrote this letter. When all government, domestic and foreign, as little as great things, shall be drawn to Washington as the center of all power, it will render powerless the checks provided of one government on another, and will become as venal and as oppressive as the government from which we have just separated. Have we arrived? Yes, we have. He wasn't a prophet. He just knew human nature. And so what we have here is the people's law that was originally established by our founders that basically have been subordinated by Rousseau's special interests and installing the Rousseau feudal ruler model of government right over our heads, right now. And I think we have one election stands between us and total dominance by this new system. We will lose our Constitution if we do not begin to change and vote many of these progressives out of office at every level of government this coming November. It's as serious as that. Well, Agenda 21, I'll give you a little bit more information on that. Mike did a great job already. Agenda 21 is a 40-chapter document that literally stands out and controls every aspect of human life. Every aspect. I can't overemphasize that point. The government will control every aspect of your life if this thing is installed. It's a soft law. It doesn't have the power of law, but it was written by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. I mentioned that last night in my talk. They've developed smart growth, biodiversity, global warming, and what is it? The purpose of the IUCN is to promote alternative models for sustainable communities and lifestyles based in what? Eco-spiritual practices and principles to accelerate our transition to a just and sustainable future. Environmental justice. This is its root. This is where it came from, is the IUCN. Humanity must undergo a radical change in its attitudes, values, and behavior. And in response to this situation, a new global ethics is taking form and is finding its expression in international law. Why? Because the IUCN writes all the international environmental treaties. What does sustainable development really mean? Well, a guy by the name of Stephen Rockefeller had taken this out of the Club of Rome and shepherded it through the IUCN into the United Nations and into a treaty and the Earth Charter, which we stopped from being accepted by the United Nations in 2002. I won't get into that very much. Michael mentioned it, but it is a new religion. Believe me, if we hadn't stopped it in 2002 in Johannesburg, South Africa, we would have a world religion right now. And backing that world religion would be a new treaty called the Covenant on the Environment and Development that would put teeth, legal teeth, to everything that I've been talking about. But we stopped it so far by the hand of God. That's all I can say. But anyway, Stephen Rockefeller, the son of Nelson Rockefeller, governor of New York State, very, very new age pantheistic believer, said this. This is how he's defined it. This is the end game, by the way. For all the sustainable development that you're seeing the definition of sustainable development as well and do something stupid today that's going to deny future generations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's their public definition. This is their private definition. This is their end game. This is where they're going to take us. Sustainable by definition means not only indefinitely prolonged, but nourishing, as the earth is nourishing to life and the self-actualization of persons and communities. Whoa. What is this communities? Communities has a dual meaning, and I'll show you what that is in a moment. But the self-actualization is obviously very new age, and it goes on to say that the word development need not be restricted to economic activity, but can mean the evolution. Evolution, by the way, is an alternative word for that is reincarnation, as you will see in the next quote. The evolution, unfolding, growth, and fulfillment of any and all aspects of life. What does he mean by life? It's not what you and I look at it as. This comes out of the United Nations Global Biodiversity Assessment. I'll talk more about that in a few minutes, but it's one of the documents that we're trying to get out of the UN that we were able to use to stop the ratification of the treaty. I'm taking it out of context a little bit here because I want to have you see this definition. Traditional or pantheistic societies, that's another name for traditional, is pantheistic societies. Pantheism, by the way, is the belief that nature is God. Very simple definition. Societies tend to view themselves as members of a community. Okay, there's that word community. Now, so what do they think about it? Not only includes other humans, but other plants, animals, as well as rocks, springs, and pools. So these inanimate, non-living entities, to you and I, are members of your community that you have to be able to support. So you shouldn't be graveling your driveways if you live in a rural area, because you would be driving over and crunching members of your community. But they're very, very, very serious about this, folks, much as the radical Islamists are about Islam. And they're implementing this on you and I without really telling us what they're doing. People are then members of a community of beings, living and non-living. So that rock is actually a being. If you believe in reincarnation, you can see it. Because rocks will reincarnate into living entities, eventually, if their karma is good, into human beings. Humans, if their karma is good, will evolve into ascended masters. This is where they're taking us. We heard last night where environmentalism almost acts like a religion. Folks, it is a religion. And I have many quotes to prove that. The United Nations has three advisors. One is the World Resource Institute for Nature, or World Institute. One is the World Wildlife Fund for Nature, and one is the IUCN. The IUCN created the other two in the 1970s so that it would not stand out. It would not be really noticeable. But it's the big mother of them all. Who belongs to the IUCN? Well, guess what? The United States Environmental Protection Agency, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Park Service, U.S. Forest Service, NOAA, NASA, you name them. They're all members. As well as ICLEI, that Michael talked about, Sierra Club, Nature Conservancy, National Wildlife Federation, National Audubon, the National Resources Defense Council, Environmental Defense Fund, and so forth. 700 of them. As well as the United Nations Environmental Program, the United Nations Development Program, UNESCO. Now, they get behind closed doors. It's not open to the public. You and I can't attend, and it's not open to the media. It's totally behind closed doors, and they develop basically their eco-spiritual agenda as to what they're going to apply and impose upon you and I. And they've done a brilliant job of it. So many of the things over the last 30 or 40 years have come out of the IUCN, and you had no clue. Being brought to us by our federal agencies with the collaboration with our non-governmental environmental organizations. It is diabolical. Now, Agenda 21, this 40-chapter document, basically, as Michael indicated, was brought out to the world as it was actually being developed over the last 20 years prior to that within the IUCN. In 1992, at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, President Clinton created the President's Council on Sustainable Development the following year. And in 1996, Sustainable America was written. And immediately after that, 7 major sub-documents of Sustainable America covering our economy were written that now every federal agency is now implementing. Many of you who have had experience in natural resource management and so forth, all of a sudden our federal government changed radically in the late 1990s. For the timber management, the Forest Service, our national cut, allowable cut, was slashed in half and then slashed in half again to meet these new terms. Why? Because the new mission statements for every federal agency is no longer to support the American people in doing a good job in producing products and so forth. It was now designed to stop the American people from harming the environment. As simple as that. And everything was redirected. Highway monies were redirected to high-speed rail and light rail. Every segment of our economy, every basic contract with the United States government through whatever federal agency, every grant that was given by a federal agency to a local community has Sustainable America strings attached to implement Agenda 21. Because Sustainable America was written to implement Agenda 21. I forgot to mention that of the 25 members of the President's Council, and you can get all this on the internet, it's right there. The 25 members of that, 12 of those members were members of the IUCN. They had this thing controlled from beginning to end, and not one vote in Congress, nothing. And we are suffering dramatically as a consequence. Upon receiving the report, the President asked us to begin implementing our recommendations, and the approach was used by local and regional levels. The Council worked in partnership with the federal government to support efforts of the U.S. Conference of Mayors and the National Association of Counties as they created the Joint Center for Sustainable Communities in 1996, just as Michael had alluded to. All of a sudden, it was rammed right down to the local government. And the COGS and so forth that he mentioned are very much implementing this right now. That's how it got in so effectively without us understanding or being even aware that it was happening. The recommendations are comprehensive, addressing everything from economic and regulatory policy to natural resource management, from strengthening communities and education to population consumption and international leadership. These things have teeth to them, folks. If you get out of line, you don't get any federal funding. In 1993, basically even before this was implemented, this is an internal working document of the EPA. It was in every federal agency in some form or another. And it says the Natural Resources and Environmental Agency should develop a joint strategy to help the United States fulfill its existing international obligations. In other words, the Convention on Biological Diversity and Agenda 21. Well, President Bush signed Agenda 21 when he went down to the Rio Summit in 1992. But the Convention on Biological Diversity he signed, but it had not yet gone to the Senate for ratification. And here they were implementing it. Federal bureaucrats were implementing international law without it even being ratified by the Senate. And it even gets worse than that. The executive branch should direct federal agencies to evaluate national policies in light of international policies and obligations, and to amend national policies to achieve international objectives, without one vote being taken in Congress. Unbelievable. You know the fastest way out of the dilemma right now? Slash the federal government by half and then slash it again by another half. President Harding did this in 1921 because Wilson left us a huge depression. It's called the Forgotten Depression because the liberals and the progressives are trying to bury it. But he got rid of that depression in a year and a half. Obama has had 4 years now, and he is still bogged down, and it's only going to get worse. I think we've seen the peak just last month, and it's going to start going downhill again because he's using the wrong method, using Keynesian economics, which will fail every single time. Keynesian, yes, thank you. Smart growth. I'm going to go through this fast. First one was actually Portland, about the same time the Santa Cruz that Michael talked about last night began to implement it. and they established an urban growth boundary. Now, what does this look in reality? They basically zoned agricultural land into developable land, and all of a sudden that land went from, let's say, $10,000 an acre at that time up to $100,000 to $200,000 an acre. And this is what it looks like from the air. On one side, you have land that's worth hundreds of thousands of dollars today. On the right, you have land that may be worth $20,000 today.
Where is this?
This is in Portland, Oregon. And whoever draws that line has tremendous political power because he can tell his friends what land is going to be within that boundary and what's going to be without. And it happens all the time. Everything that this sustainable development does open the doors wide open to corruption. Now, what does it do? Real family mean income for Portland stayed pretty constant, but this is what happened to real housing prices. Increased by 300% because of smart growth. It's not the only one. In the Institute for Economic Research at Harvard University, basically those cities in the country that have still natural zoning, the land is worth maybe $30,000 to $40,000 per quarter acre lot. In those areas, like San Francisco and so forth, that have had smart growth the longest, the land is worth up to $600,000 a quarter acre lot. And it's all due to regulations, all of it. It is breaking the back of average homeowners and so forth because they cannot afford these. The relative housing price index for those areas that are in smart growth, when we had the housing crash in 2007, lost the value the most. Those who basically had no smart growth did not suffer nearly as much. Everything about smart growth is bad. Everything. Just take that back to your city council when they're considering these things and just say it's a mess waiting to happen if we get into this. Every study that's ever been done. So this is the dumbest thing that we could possibly do. Now, finally, the Wildlands Project, and I'll go through this quickly. He's coming up with his shepherd hook. The United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity was introduced in 1992. It was written by the IUCN in 1981. It was only an 18-page treaty. Basically, it was explained by the United Nations Global Biodiversity Assessment, one of the most anti-human documents ever published by a government entity. It was shocking when I read this the first time. The United Nations Biodiversity Assessment starts out by saying this: the Western worldview is characteristic of large-scale societies heavily dependent upon resources brought in from considerable distances. It is a worldview that is characterized by the denial of the sacred attributes of nature, which became firmly established about 2,000 years ago. Well, what became firmly established 2,000 years ago? He names Judaism and Islam, but it's Christianity. It goes on for page after page describing how Christianity is the root of all of our environmental holocausts that exist today. And you heard Michael talk about the fact that the United Nations, basically every agreement that we enter into, basically it puts the government in charge of private property or control all property, and this is no exception. Property rights are not absolute, they're not unchanging, they're not unalienable, but rather a complex and dynamic and shifting relationship between two or more parties over time or space. In other words, they're whatever the government wants them to be today. But it goes on to say this, and this is one of the things that shocked me. One option for insurance against excessive species depletion is the allocation of private property or property rights. The reallocation of property rights implies the redistribution of assets. Well, I guess it does, doesn't it? Property rights can still be allocated to the environmental public good, but in this case, they should be restricted to usufructual. What's usufructual? I had no idea. I have a PhD and never heard the word before. It sounds like a swear word. And And I looked it up in my old college dictionary that sits on my desk, or at least it used to. I use the internet now, but nonetheless, at the time, I used that old college dictionary, which was pretty ancient in itself. You won't find it in the modern dictionaries, but the college dictionary basically said that the usufruct system was started by the old Roman Empire, and it means that the Caesar owns everything. And he allocates to whom he will the rights and privileges to use that property for whatever purpose. It is horrifying to realize what they're setting up for us. You saw this in Michael's presentation. The agricultural world in which most human beings are peasants should be able to support 5 to 7 billion people. Folks, we have 7 billion people. That means we all have to become agrarian peasants, or in contrast, a reasonable estimate for an industrialized world society at the present North American material standard of living would be 1 billion people. That's where they're taking us. And this is the smoking gun. To protect and recover biodiversity, representative areas of all major ecosystems in the region need to be reserved. Reserve blocks should be as large as possible. Buffer zones should be established around these core areas, and the corridor should connect these areas. This basic design is central to the Wildlands Project. We had been down to the Senate in July. We had miraculously stopped, explained last night, miraculously stopped the ratification in August. Just phenomenal. And then in September, when it came up again, we got a document out of the IUCN. I don't have time to explain how we did it, but nonetheless, in another miraculous move, and God has a sense of humor, folks, through a series of events, the IUCN itself sent us the document that we used to stop the treaty in the U.S. Senate from ratifying the treaty. It was astounding. And it was this quote that did it, because we had already explained to the Senate it was the Wildlands Project. And what is the Wildlands Project? Well, what you're seeing developing there, all the red areas are now wilderness corridors, and the yellow areas are human restricted zones where only limited human activity can occur. There's not much green left, is there? That's why we need to reduce the human population to 1 billion people. It is diabolical. I can go in and spend the next half an hour explaining how they intend to do that, but I can't do that. No. See, the master up here is getting out his crook. It's done by gap analysis. We stopped the treaty from being ratified, but gap analysis is now where you have digitized information, layers upon layers, hundreds of these layers, that are analyzing areas where you should be putting some of these reserves and corridors. This is where I anticipated in 1994 when I drew the map. And this is what you have now. This is what they're doing right now. And with that, before he does get that crook out, I will conclude, and I thank you very much.